Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Donna Leinwand. I'm a reporter at USA Today and I'm past president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming, like events such as this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you attending today's event. Our audience today includes guests of our speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. And if you hear applause in our audience, we'd note that members of the general public are attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. After our guest's speech concludes, we'll have a Q&A, and I will ask as many questions as time permits. One might think that the First Amendment is well established today. After all, the 45 words written by James Madison took effect nearly 220 years ago on December 15th, 1791. Yet we still wrestle with the application of those freedoms, even today. Just yesterday, police arrested a reporter from the Post-Star newspaper in Glens Falls, New York, after he refused to leave a crime scene. So it's clear nearly 220 years after our founding fathers assured us those freedoms that there is still work to be done so that each generation understands the depths of those rights. I can think of no better person to lead this discussion than our speaker today, Ken Paulson, a First Amendment lawyer and the former editor of USA Today. As editor-in-chief of the nation's largest circulation daily newspaper, Mr. Paulson got up close and personal with the First Amendment every day. He defended the paper's right to publish tough stories that challenged our government, our citizens, and our values, as a good newspaper is supposed to do. Also with us today is another man who has focused his life's work on the First Amendment, Charles Overby, CEO of the Newseum, Freedom Forum, and Diversity Institute. If you could stand for a minute. Let me also acknowledge Jack Marsh, president of the Freedom Forum Diversity Institute, who oversees the annual Al Newharth Free Spirit Scholarship and Journalism Conference. Good stand. And of course, joining us from the conference are 51 high school journalists, one from each state and the District of Columbia. They are at the National Press Club today to get a first-hand look at the news business. And if you all could please stand. Mr. Paulson, who was part of the team of reporters who launched USA Today, now serves as president and CEO of the First Amendment Center and president of the American Society of News Editors, fitting posts for a man who has spent 33 years dedicated to preserving, protecting, and using the First Amendment. Please join me in welcoming to the Press Club, Ken Paulson.
Thank you, Donna, for that very gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and we're so glad to see the next generation of America's journalists join us here today. We have 51 plus some additional professional ringers who are in the room. That means it's a really good turnout for a press event, comparable to what the NASA administrator had last week. But you have collectively driven the median age down by decades. So I wanted to begin today by acknowledging just a few more people who have been so instrumental and essential to our First Amendment efforts. First of all, there is the founder of the First Amendment Center, one of the nation's leading voices on behalf of those 5 freedoms, and a journalist of great distinction, Mr. John Siegenthaler. I also want to thank Freedom Forum trustees Malcolm Kirschenbaum, Peter Pritchard, Michael Coleman, and Jan Newharth for their steadfast support for our First Amendment work. Thank you very much. It is good to see my colleagues from the Freedom Forum. The senior management team is here in full force, and we appreciate you being here. Also, our good friends from AS&E, including the new executive director, Richard Carpel, and our lawyer, Kevin Goldberg. So if anything ugly or dangerous breaks out here, he's the man to see. AS&E has been around for almost a century and has spent its entire existence defending and fighting for the First Amendment, and we appreciate that very much. So we're delighted you're all here. There are two more gentlemen I want to mention here because they'll be back during the Q&A. Gene Policinski, who is the Senior Vice President for the First Amendment Center and who also did a lot of the heavy lifting on the survey. Gene is right there. He worked with a PERT group and Ken Dautrick to make sure the appropriate questions were asked and the answers were given promptly. And then Dr. Charles Haynes, who is the director of the Religious Freedom Education Project at the museum, and we'll hear from both men shortly. You know, it was just 8 days ago that close to 1 million people gathered about 4 blocks from here on the mall to celebrate the 4th of July and watch an astonishing fireworks display. And all across America, in towns large and small, people did the same, with parades down Main Street and patriotic pageantry. Clearly, we do a very good job in this country of celebrating the Declaration of Independence. And we should. After all, it's one of the most important documents in American history, arguably one of the 3 most important documents. Another of those documents, of course, is the U.S. Constitution. And while we don't shoot off fireworks in its honor, we do hold National Constitution Day on September 17th. And we require that every single public school teach about the Constitution. And then there's the Bill of Rights. Ratified 220 years ago on December 15th of this year, it guaranteed personal liberty for all Americans, including promises of free expression, freedom of faith, the right to bear arms, and a fair judicial process. Surely we're celebrating, right? But there are no fireworks, and there are no classroom observances on December 15th. Has anyone ever wished you a happy Bill of Rights Day? Not likely. Hallmark does not make a Bill of Rights card. The truth is we just don't celebrate the Bill of Rights in this country. Not that some didn't try. In fact, as far back as 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw the celebration of the Bill of Rights as a weapon in America's war against totalitarianism, describing those freedoms as a threat to the Nazis and proclaiming December 15th as a federal holiday, Bill of Rights Day. Here's what FDR said then, quote, "To Hitler, the freedom of men to think as they please and speak as they please and worship as they please is of all things imaginable, most hateful, and most desperately to be feared." FDR believed that there would be national celebrations from that date forward, from the date of his proclamation. And he said, quote, "No date in the long history of freedom means more to liberty-loving men in all liberty-loving countries than the 15th day of December, 1791. So what happened? Well, Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entry into World War II. Bill of Rights Day simply never took hold. I share that moment in history because it illustrates the American public's sense of the Bill of Rights, and particularly our relationship to the First Amendment. We tend to appreciate freedom in the abstract. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. These are phrases with a patriotic resonance, and Americans generally feel pretty good about them. But in terms of specifics, Americans actually know very little about what the First Amendment says. Each year we begin our State of the First Amendment survey with this question: can you name any of the specific rights that are guaranteed by the First Amendment? It turns out that 30% of Americans have absolutely no idea. A majority, 62%, know that freedom of speech is contained in the First Amendment. But awareness drops off dramatically from there. As you can see, 19% know freedom of religion. 17% know freedom of the press. 14% know about the right of assembly, and 3% know the right of petition. So overall, fewer than 3% of Americans can name the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. Now, Americans may not be fully versed in the 5 freedoms, but they do have strong opinions about them, particularly freedom of the press and freedom of religion. So given our location at the National Press Club, let's begin with a focus on freedom of the press. There's good news and bad news for journalists in this survey. 76% of those surveyed agree that it is important for our democracy that the news media act as a watchdog on government. In addition, there's very strong support for shield laws, with 75% of those surveyed, 3 in 4, saying that journalists should be allowed to keep a news source confidential, matching the highest level of support and the highest intensity of that support we've seen in polling on that question over the past decade. As Donna Linewine knows well, during my tenure as editor of USA Today, we put stringent controls on the use of anonymous sources in place because we believed they were being overused and they could undermine the credibility of our news report. Oddly enough, today, it just seems like the least important stories seem to have the most anonymity. The words confidential sources and Lindsay Lohan should never appear in the same sentence. You should save this stuff for national security. There are instances in which corruption, threats to public safety, and government misconduct can really only be revealed by a whistleblower, and few of them are willing to go public. And on those occasions, some editors view the use of confidential sources as a critical tool, and increasingly Americans seem to agree with that view. So, does all of this translate into greater respect for the reporting done by news media? Apparently not. We asked this year whether people agreed with this statement. Quote, overall, the news media try to report the news without bias. 47%, almost 1 in 2, strongly disagrees with that statement. Another 19% mildly disagree, which means that almost 66% of Americans, 2 out of 3, don't buy the notion that the press tries to be fair. Speaking of bias and trust, survey results also indicate that television remains the most trustworthy source of news, with 40% citing TV, followed by newspapers, news websites, and radio. There is also an essentially even split between those who most trust national newspapers, national television, and national radio versus those who trust local newspapers, television, and radio. Regarding television, the survey also shows strong public support, 78% for televising the proceedings of the U.S. Supreme Court. Candidly, the numbers would be somewhat different if we polled the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Souter famously said, "The day you see a camera come into our courtroom, it's going to roll over my dead body." That doesn't leave a lot of room for negotiation, frankly. There is good news in this survey for high school students, including the student journalists we have in our audience today. For the first time in our polling, a majority of those surveyed say that public high school students should be allowed to report on controversial issues in their student newspapers without the approval of school authorities. That's very, very important. As professional news media have lost their resources and scaled back coverage, there are very few journalists watching schools. Student journalists are in a unique position to see what's really going on in America's schools and classrooms. Increasingly, Americans also believe that students should have significant latitude in using their own personal computers at home to express themselves. We've had some remarkable decisions in the federal courts recently, the Third Circuit, that clearly stood up for the free speech rights of students and said as long as the expression was being done off campus, away from school, that administrators had no right to reach that, and the survey results are supportive of that finding. The survey results show that 62%, almost 2 out of 3 Americans, believe that public schools should not be allowed to discipline students for comments posted away from school. Turning to freedom of religion, the survey shows 67%, about 2 out of 3, believe that the First Amendment requires a clear separation of church and state. We also asked whether freedom of religion applies to all religions, even if a faith is regarded as extreme or fringe. 67% said the guarantee applies to people of all religions, the highest number we've seen on that question in a decade. Each year we try to explore a bit about how Americans feel about controversial art or music. And this year we asked whether musicians should be allowed to sing songs with lyrics that others might find offensive. It appears that CeeLo is in the clear. 67% said that offensive lyrics should be protected. By the way, we first asked that question in 1997, and only 51% at the time said offensive music should be protected. That number has gone up every single year, steadily. I think it's a generational shift, largely. And this is a good time, really, to mention one of the First Amendment Center's long-running initiatives, a celebration of free speech and music called Freedom Sings. The show, which features a cast of singers, songwriters, and Grammy-winning artists, tells the story of the First Amendment through a century of controversial songs. And it's been performed on more than 100 college campuses. We're actually doing a performance of Freedom Sings tonight. And any of you who are here, I know the 51 scholars will be there, but anyone else who has an interest in an evening of controversial and dirty songs, please come to the museum. 7:45, a good time will be had by all. Just let us know before you leave and we'll get you a ticket. And before we move on to your questions, it's really fair to ask, so does any of this matter? Why does this survey matter? After all, there's no movement to repeal the First Amendment. Is there a really threat to these freedoms? Well, it depends. You know, support for the First Amendment is inevitably going to be soft when most Americans don't really know what it says. And the irony is that there are other things that every single patriotic American absolutely knows. Ask anyone, who designed the American flag? And the immediate response is always Betsy Ross. And yet historians tell us Betsy did no such thing and probably never even met a founding father. Similarly, most Americans can recite the Pledge of Allegiance without a second thought. And yet, as we know today, fewer than 3 in 100 can tell you the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. Unless we really understand these 5 freedoms, press, speech, religion, and the rights of petition and assembly, and the way they collectively ensure our democracy, the First Amendment will always be vulnerable. You know, each year our survey asks whether the First Amendment gives society too much freedom. And this year the result was 18%. 18% said, you know, First Amendment freedoms go a little too far in American society. In the survey we did in the months following the attack of 9/11, that number jumped to 49%. 1 American in 2. That tragic day caused literally millions of Americans to change their minds about how much freedom we could afford. It's not a coincidence that the most successful, vibrant, creative, and powerful nation in the history of the planet is also the most free, and that is something worth celebrating. Thank you all very much.
I'd like to remind the aspiring journalists in the room that each and every one of you should have a really good question for me. So don't forget about your cards in the middle of the table. Try and think of some good ones and pass them up to me in the front. But we're going to start with a question I believe is from a student. Oh, no, not. If your survey had been conducted in newsrooms, do you think the results would differ greatly from the results from the general public?
I think newsrooms and professional journalists feel very strongly about freedom of the press, and may or may not be cognizant of the other 4 freedoms. I do think that professional journalists have a special mission, and I will say we because it's not been that long since I've been out of a newsroom. If you go back to the origins of this country and the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791, as my friend John Siegenthaler and I have said many times in our travels, the American people did not want to ratify the U.S. Constitution. They rejected it out of hand because they were concerned about the kind of power given to a new leader. It could have been George Washington for all I knew. They didn't trust whoever was going to be named to the presidency. They wanted protections and they demanded a Bill of Rights. And at the very outset of this nation, that first generation of Americans said we absolutely have to have freedom of the press. And I think that created an obligation for all journalists to stand up for all rights. And historically, I think the industry has done a much better job of defending freedom of the press than freedom of speech and freedom of faith. But it is our mission, it is our collective mission, and we need to do a better job of protecting the entire Bill of Rights.
Why do you think support for religious freedom is rising? Do you think if you asked about specific religions, the answers might be different?
I want to invite Dr. Haynes to the podium now. He has spent his entire career working on issues of religious freedom, particularly as it involves public schools.
I'm not sure I would say it's rising, but I think the question has caught the tension between believing in religious freedom in the abstract, and then when you ask people about specific issues, the support might go down. But from this survey, I think it's heartening that, first of all, the American people understand that because some people label religions extreme doesn't mean they shouldn't be protected by the First Amendment. That's very important because, of course, in the 19th century, that would have meant Catholics, Mormons, and others. Today, people might think of Muslims or some other group that they consider extreme. Nevertheless, a vast majority of the American people would say they're supported. But I think the most surprising finding in the survey to me is not just support for religious freedom. That's easy. Lots of people for religious freedom. But does the First Amendment require a clear separation of church and state? Well, I'm blown away by the fact that 67% of the American people say, yes, it does. Why do I say that? Well, because people on both extremes in our country have tried for years to really undo commitment to the separation of church and state, which is a core condition for religious freedom. Our founders, going all the way back to Roger Williams, believed that you can't have full freedom of religion unless you separate the institutions of church and state. However, in recent decades, people on one side, the Christian nation folks, have tried to convince the American people that, quote, separation of church and state isn't in the First Amendment. And of course, that's a play on words. The words aren't in the First Amendment, but the principle is definitely in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion is the principle of separation. Nevertheless, they've tried hard to say we are founded as a Christian nation, and at best, we should tolerate other people to be here. You know, we're the majority. They have failed, if this survey is correct, in convincing people after decades and decades of propaganda trying to convince people of that. On the other end of the spectrum, however, the freedom from religion crowd, and there are a bunch of those folks, they sue every time they see religion in the public square. Somebody, a private group, puts up a creche in a park, and other people are allowed to put up displays. Oh, can't do that. You know, separation of church and state. It's given separation a very bad name. But I don't think they've succeeded either. I think most Americans understand, I hope they do, that the First Amendment separates church from state, but not religion from politics or public life. I would like to think, I don't know, I can't read the minds of all the people who took the survey, I would like to think that these results are good news for that core principle of religious freedom, separation, that I really think protects the freedom of all of us.
Do you feel that any of the rights particularly protected under the First Amendment are under threat?
You know, it's what I talked about at the very beginning. We love freedom in the abstract, and it takes something pretty dramatic to change our mind about that. But there is this tension between freedom and fear. Always has been. Every time during World War I, during the Civil War, Lincoln's generals shut down newsrooms, yet there was freedom of the press. You know, the espionage acts of various decades. When the country is under duress and in a climate of fear, the Red Scare led to McCarthyism, concern about spies and espionage and led in World War II to the internment of Japanese American citizens. So it's never, the First Amendment's in trouble right now. It's when you least expect it. It's when that thing comes out of nowhere to threaten America and threaten our people. That's when the real test is. And the work we do, frankly, is to try to build up a reservoir of goodwill for the First Amendment so that when those bad things happen, the immediate impulse is to say, don't mess with the First Amendment and don't mess with freedom. And so you can never tell when and where that will come, and it's important us to build up that goodwill, understanding, and awareness now.
Do you see any looming threats now? Anything, you know, on the current landscape that might be a threat?
I would say that issues involving the freedom of the press. You look at the scandal in Great Britain right now and the hacking of phones. That's an internal threat to freedom of the press. And one of the concerns I have, and this is real old school. When I was a newspaper editor, and I've been one for many years, I always used to preach to my staff, put out a newspaper that doesn't clash with breakfast. And what I meant by that is that we have to have an ongoing relationship with our readers every single day. And so if we have a grotesque car crash in the front of the Green Bay Press-Gazette tomorrow morning, somebody with whom we've had a relationship for 15 years might be so offended, so troubled, feel betrayed by that content that they would stop their relationship with us. We had to create a family of readers, really, and keep that family of readers. And yet now the dynamics have changed dramatically, and every news organization is not so much committed to the family of readers because they've lost some of them in actually increasing numbers. And we're living for the moment. We're living for the first person to post that story. We're living for the expose that will drive traffic. We're living for the gossip that will drive attention and focus and attention to our tweets. And all of that is fine in a way, but it does change our culture in ways we may not have foreseen. And the concern I've got now is that are we at a place where we've forgotten the old rules? Two sources perhaps on important stories, authoritative sources. So it's not enough that TMZ posts a story to make it worth putting on your front page, and yet increasingly people are reporting, well, as TMZ reported, without any independent reporting. A lot of old school values have fallen by the boards, and that worries me. That makes me old school, but ethics are pretty old school, and I think that's where the threat to the industry lies.
Could the First Amendment survive a news of the world type of scandal in the U.S., and do you believe Congress would start legislating against the press if something like that were to happen?
Well, it's pretty stunning what's going on with Murdoch's empire right now. And what's particularly stunning is the unanimity of condemnation and the calls for legislative action in Great Britain. And it would not take a great leap for people to try to mess with the free press here. I think it's unlikely that there would be any attempt at kind of prior restraint in this country, but I think they could easily write New York Times v. Sullivan, in a way through an amendment to the Constitution. And make the press that much more vulnerable. We lose Times v. Sullivan, we lose investigative reporting in this country. And it's there that we'd be vulnerable. Nobody's going to repeal the Free Press Clause of the First Amendment. They can make us awfully uncomfortable. And so the First Amendment would survive, but it might have an asterisk that we can't afford to have.
Okay. Do high school journalists have the same rights as professional journalists? And how do we protect our rights to publish articles we want in our school paper?
I want to invite my colleague Gene Policinski to come up here because I know a little later today he's doing a presentation on this very topic. I also want to make sure we get some quality video time for the man who largely constructed this survey, Gene Policinski.
Well, I'd love to be able to tell the journalists in the room who are students that you do, and the plain, simple answer is that the answer is no. There are more legal hurdles for you. There is, I think, a fear abroad. Ken talked about the impact on other areas of the First Amendment. I think there's fear abroad when your inventiveness, your inquisitiveness is married to new technology that they haven't quite figured out on the administrative level yet how to control that in some cases. They're very uncomfortable with your new interest in exactly what's going on now, and perhaps the willingness to push the boundaries a little bit. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight, but I think there are certainly ways that you can get, through your own work as well as some legal protections, ways to guarantee as much freedom of the press as is possible. It just puzzles me in any number of areas in our surveys where we find that people don't learn much about the First Amendment. They don't learn much, particularly in schools, by example about the First Amendment. And then somehow you're supposed to spring full-blown at age 18 or age 21 into being citizens who are actively pursuing and knowing. And that just doesn't happen without education. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight is ways you can actually help educate adults and others and administrators and teachers and people in your community about the way the First Amendment can work and the tremendous value you can bring as journalists to your opportunities at your school. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Do you feel the internet will offer more ways to express First Amendment rights and to broaden those rights, or will new laws be brought about by the web revolution that ultimately restrict our First Amendment liberties?
Well, the good news is that in 1997, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the Internet was protected by the First Amendment. And a lot of people missed that decision. It may not have seemed as important in 1997 as it does today. And so it has full First Amendment protection. Americans are free to use it as they would a newspaper, pad and pencil. And what I love about the Internet is it's really the killer app of the First Amendment. If James Madison were around today, I'm confident he would be blogging, and very happy man.
Why do you think TV news is becoming more credible than other forms?
As a lifelong newspaper man, I am tempted to say beats me. Surveys for decades have shown us the same thing, and a big part of it is there is a friendly face in your living room, and that makes all the difference. Television can touch you in a way that newsprint cannot. And so you develop a relationship with a local anchor that you just don't have about the local newspaper editor, and I think that goes a long way in building a sense of trust.
So why do more than 60% of Americans think that the press is biased? Are they right?
Well, I think we live in an increasingly polarized country, and it's interesting that in 1791, newspapers were started for the express purpose, at 1791, the year the First Amendment was established, newspapers were established to attack political rivals. You didn't make a buck. There was very little ad revenue from the local mall in 1791. You made a point, you made a political point, and you attacked your rivals. So at a time when the press was absolutely biased and dedicated to that cause, that's when we said there has to be freedom of the press. And throughout the last century, the last 2 centuries, newspapers have had Republican or Democratic identification. It's only in recent years that has stopped. And the irony is that there may be more ethics codes in place, there may be less real political bias than there has ever been, but because society is polarized. Let me just tell you, I do think there is a bias in America's newsrooms. It's not left, it's not right, it's against whoever is in charge right now. And that's always been part of the mission.
Okay. This is my favorite question ever. When you were in high school in 1856, were you taught the First Amendment? If so, did you take it seriously?
I will find you. Apparently that was, Gene Policinski just raised his hand confessing he wrote that. And of course he sat next to me in the 3rd grade, so. Yeah, that's right, that's right. You know, it's interesting, we have now gone back to look at grade school books from my era. And they're still exist, mildewed, but they're still around. And no, we have never taught the First Amendment well in America's schools. You find very often that there are 3 of the 5 freedoms mentioned. There's a book I often use that shows freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, and then goes way off, freedom of enterprise, the right to make a buck. We have never done a very good job, and I did not learn the First Amendment. I learned the First Amendment as a high school newspaper editor when I needed the First Amendment, and it served me well ever since.
Okay, and now for our last question. How do we change or improve the public perception of the First Amendment?
I love that as a final question because it gives me a chance to mention some work we've been doing. Founded in partnership with AS&E 3 years ago, we began talking about how do you change public perception of the First Amendment? How do you make sure a generation like yours has a better understanding and more enthusiasm about the First Amendment? And we began thinking about what has there been out there where they took like an unpalatable product and make it kind of hip and exciting, and immediately thought of the Got Milk campaign, right? Milk mustaches on celebrities. And so we went to the people who ran that campaign and we said, you know, we know you're good enough to promote dairy products, but how are you on constitutional rights and can you protect the First Amendment? And they responded to the challenge. They worked closely with us. The Knight Foundation was extraordinarily helpful. McCormick Foundation joined us. And together we crafted a campaign called One for All. One amendment for all Americans. One amendment that protects all freedoms. And this is what it looks like. If you would check the site out, it's oneforall.us. And it gives teachers lesson plans so they can do a better job of teaching about the First Amendment. But also we have a YouTube video contest and all kinds of entertaining things. And then as the campaign before us set the tone, we actually have recruited a remarkable number of artists, and here's an ad featuring Brad Paisley, who's our most recent spokesperson. Before that was a young woman you may know called Kesha. And Ellen DeGeneres has signed on, John Mellencamp, David Gregory, a remarkable mix of performers, artists, and journalists endorsing the First Amendment and simply delivering the message that thanks to the First Amendment you can be whatever and whoever you want to be. And we think that's a valuable valuable message for every single generation. Thank you for your time and thank you for your attention.
Okay, we are just about out of time before you guys move on to your next activity, but I just wanted to remind our audience of some upcoming speakers. On July 13th, Ted Leonsis, the majority owner of NHL's Washington Capitals and the NBA's Washington Wizards, will be here. On July 15th, Tim Armstrong, chairman and CEO of AOL, and Ariana Huffington, the president and editor, will be speaking. She'll be discussing the aftermath of the Huffington Post merger and the future of journalism. And on July 18th, Gregory Jasko, chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, will be here. And second, I would like to present our guests with the traditional NPC mug. I believe this is not your first.
Thank you very much.
So now you have a matching set. Thank you all for coming today. I'd also like to thank the National Press Club staff, including the library and the broadcast center, for helping to organize today's event. And finally, here's a reminder that we have student memberships of at the National Press Club, and you can find out more information about joining the National Press Club at our website at www.press.org. Thank you very much. We are adjourned. Man who has spent 33 years dedicated to preserving, protecting, and using the First Amendment. Please join me in welcoming to the Press Club Ken Paulson.
Thank you, Donna, for that very gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and we're so glad to see the next generation of America's journalists join us here today. We have 51 plus some additional professional ringers who are in the room. That means it's a really good turnout for a press event, comparable to what the NASA administrator had last week. But you have collectively driven the median age down by decades. So I wanted to begin today by acknowledging just a few more people who have been so instrumental and essential to our First Amendment efforts. First of all, there is the founder of the First Amendment Center, one of the nation's leading voices on behalf of those 5 freedoms, and a journalist of great distinction, Mr. John Siegenthaler. I also want to thank Freedom Forum trustees Malcolm Kirschenbaum,
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Donna Leinwand. I'm a reporter at USA Today and I'm past president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming, like events such as this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you attending today's event. Our audience today includes guests of our speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. And if you hear applause in our audience, we'd note that members of the general public are attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. After our guest's speech concludes, we'll have a Q&A, and I will ask as many questions as time permits. One might think that the First Amendment is well established today. After all, the 45 words written by James Madison took effect nearly 220 years ago on December 15th, 1791. Yet we still wrestle with the application of those freedoms, even today. Just yesterday, police arrested a reporter from the Post-Star newspaper in Glens Falls, New York, after he refused to leave a crime scene. So it's clear nearly 220 years after our founding fathers assured us those freedoms that there is still work to be done so that each generation understands the depths of those rights. I can think of no better person to lead this discussion than our speaker today, Ken Paulson, a First Amendment lawyer and the former editor of USA Today. As editor-in-chief of the nation's largest circulation daily newspaper, Mr. Paulson got up close and personal with the First Amendment every day. He defended the paper's right to publish tough stories that challenged our government, our citizens, and our values, as a good newspaper is supposed to do. Also with us today is another man who has focused his life's work on the First Amendment, Charles Overby, CEO of the Newseum, Freedom Forum, and Diversity Institute. If you could stand for a minute. Let me also acknowledge Jack Marsh, president of the Freedom Forum Diversity Institute, who oversees the annual Al Newharth Free Spirit Scholarship and Journalism Conference. If you could stand. And of course, joining us from the conference are 51 high school journalists, one from each state and the District of Columbia. They are at the National Press Club today to get a firsthand look at the news business. And if you all could please stand. Mr. Paulson, who was part of the team of reporters who launched USA Today, now serves as president and CEO of the First Amendment Center and president of the American Society of News Editors, fitting posts for
Peter Pritchard, Michael Coleman, and Jan Newharth for their steadfast support for our First Amendment work. Thank you very much. It is good to see my colleagues from the Freedom Forum. The senior management team is here in full force, and we appreciate you being here. Also, our good friends from AS&E, including the new executive director, Richard Carpel, and our lawyer, Kevin Goldberg. So if anything ugly or dangerous breaks out here, he's the man to see. AS&E has been around for almost a century and has spent its entire existence defending and fighting for the First Amendment, and we appreciate that very much. So we're delighted you're all here. There are two more gentlemen I want to mention here because they'll be back during the Q&A. Gene Policinski, who is the Senior Vice President for the First Amendment Center and who also did a lot of the heavy lifting on this survey. Gene is right there. He worked with a PERT group and Ken Dautrick to make sure the appropriate questions were asked and the answers were given promptly. And then Dr. Charles Haynes, who is the director of the Religious Freedom Education Project at the Newseum, and we'll hear from both men shortly. You know, it was just